Well, today more Israeli bombs fell on the centre of Beirut. The latest attack against Hezbollah coming after more than 100 were killed yesterday in airstrikes across Lebanon. Meanwhile, demonstrations in Australia have been infiltrated by pro-Hezbollah activists publicly supporting the terrorist organisation.
The chaotic aftermath of the Israeli airstrike that hit central Beirut early this morning, killing another high-ranking Hezbollah commander. It's the first time Israel has struck Lebanon's capital city in almost 2 decades. More than 1,000 people have been killed and up to 1 million forced to flee their homes due to Israel's attacks across the country. Hamas claiming today its leader in Lebanon was killed during an airstrike in the south. It comes as Lebanon is in 3 days of mourning for Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, killed by an airstrike on Friday.
Israel made a very big mistake. It will regret it. Israel will bear the consequences, not us.
The assassination prompting small groups of protesters at pro-Palestine and Lebanon rallies in Melbourne and Sydney to wave Hezbollah flags and carry framed pictures of the organisation's slain leaders. A move widely condemned by politicians in Australia, where Hezbollah is officially a terrorist organisation.
We've seen worrying signs over the weekend. We do not want people to bring radical ideologies and conflict here.
It not only threatens national security, but fuels fear and division in our communities.
The Immigration Minister threatening to cancel the visas of those involved.
People who are on visas here need to be mindful of that, and if you do the wrong thing, then your visa will be cancelled.
While the opposition claims that doesn't go far enough.
I find it completely unacceptable that the government wouldn't be arresting people already or cancelling visas of people who are glorifying Hezbollah and Hamas and others.
These are despicable and reprehensible acts to see people celebrating the life of a terrorist, and it has no place in Australia.
The AFP says it's expecting at least 6 reports of crime from Victoria Police relating to the protest, but maintains the public display of a prohibited symbol doesn't justify an arrest. So as demonstrators in Australia take to the streets to support a terrorist organisation and the violence in Lebanon is growing, can we keep the tension here at bay?
Tasnim Sammak is from the Free Palestine Coalition, one of the organisers behind the rallies on the weekend. Tasnim, for almost a year now, these Free Palestine protests have been peaceful. So what was your reaction when you found out that the flag of Hezbollah, which is considered a terror group, was being waved at the protests?
So I was there yesterday. We started the day with our usual chants, drums, speeches against Israel's genocide being committed in Gaza, but also now expanded into Lebanon. And this morning we saw attacks on Yemen. And there were members of the community, the broader Middle Eastern community, who did join to mourn Nasrallah, who was assassinated just that night before the rally.
Were you surprised or disappointed that those flags and photos were there?
I wasn't surprised because, Hezbollah now is in battle. Israel has invaded Lebanon, declared war on Lebanon, and Hezbollah is a militant group that has, popular support. It's part of the Lebanese government. There's, 3 days of mourning right now in Lebanon and 5 days of mourning in Iran. That is a way to, show that respect to Nasrallah. And whether, we agree or disagree with that, that's the geopolitical situation. And that's kind of what reflected what happened at our rally here.
Well, here it is the law, and here our politicians came down pretty hard on those protesters. The Prime Minister said we do not want to bring radical ideologies and conflict here, while our Foreign Affairs Minister Penny Wong says the flags threaten national security and fuel fear and division. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I think that's what the government does. It goes and peddles this sort of rhetoric. I think it's dog whistling, to be honest, because we're seeing today in the news that some of the mosques in Sydney that are more from the Shia community, they're also holding events to mourn Nasrallah. And I don't think that it's right to harass community members because they held a flag that for them represents many things, even though the Australian government wants to reduce it to a representation of, like an evil ideology.
I hear your defence of the terror group, as Sarah's mentioned. Nasrallah himself, when you read the background of this man who's been a leader of that group for 30 years, has been involved in some of the most deadly terror attacks in the world. How can we defend people carrying photographs of him in the streets of Australia?
I don't think I've defended Hezbollah or people who are carrying his photo. I've just recognised that that is sometimes what people do. They carry photos in a nationalistic way of an assassinated leader who was assassinated with an airstrike that caused a massacre in Lebanon and 6 residential buildings to be destroyed. I think it's our duty to kind of provide an analysis that makes sense rather than just look at things from, a higher moral ground. Because if we do that, we won't actually reach any solutions.
As a protest organiser, would it be much easier for you if these things weren't done and weren't attracting all the attention? Would you, for example, call on people attending future protests not to bring them?
It is the reality on the ground that, allows actually for militant groups to gain popularity, because Israel has declared a war with Hezbollah, and that is the context that this flag was raised. I know that it's easier for us to just reduce the issues, but we cannot speak about war in binary terms and in very simplistic ways, because that is not going to end this escalation. So it's not my job here to moralise the issue and then lead to further demonisation of these already victimised communities. And you and I can say, oh, this is, condemnable. How does that change the experience of being in a battlefield with bombs raining on you and your people?
All right, Tasnim, thank you very much for your time tonight. We'll watch the story from here.
Thank you.
Look, I think the Australian public today and over the weekend have got every right to be very confused. Nasrallah is a deadly terrorist. He's been responsible for some horrible terrorist attacks, killing of Americans and all sorts of people. And yet you can walk down the street with a framed photograph of him after he was taken out by Israel because they believed that taking him out might protect their southern border. So the AFP have put out this sort of strange statement tonight, whereas they say, oh, well, just carrying a flag, forget the flag, or the photograph, I presume they say, doesn't justify any police action.
But there
now,
were
the Australian
as well.
public sat through COVID protests where people who were protesting being locked in their houses were fired on with rubber bullets and arrested and dragged down the street.
But that's...
How does that work?
Yeah, OK. That's a total apples and oranges argument.
Well, it's not.
No, it is, because they weren't being... the issue there wasn't protest. The issue there was COVID regulations and gathering. It's like such an exceptional circumstance. I just think to try to draw the line is just...
Do you think
crazy.
that people should be able to carry that flag and photographs of that murderous terrorist in the streets of Australia?
Well, I certainly don't like it. I mean, I've got nothing good to say about Hezbollah, not just over attacks of civilians in Israel, but, the role in the Syrian civil war, for example, the support of Shia militias in Iraq. We could go on about that for ages. The point the AFP are making, though, is a legal point. And it's a bit of a subtle one. But unfortunately, the law is a subtle... Actually, not unfortunately. Fortunately, the law is a subtle thing. What they're saying is there are criminal offences that attach to using certain symbols. Remember, this was legislation that was brought in about Nazi symbols primarily. It wasn't really... This wasn't what people had in mind. It was mostly about Nazi symbols. And they're saying that the way the law is drafted, the offence isn't merely holding up that symbol or doing the Nazi salute, for example. That's not all that's required for the offence. That's necessary for the offence, but it's not all of it. There also needs to be other elements. So they talk about, for example, it has to spread ideas based on racial superiority or hatred. It has to...
So the chance that they were allegedly saying as well?
Yeah, and there's more basically incitement, vilification.
Yeah.
That's where it gets tricky, and that's where I think the police investigation will take some time, because what they'll be looking at is they'll say, OK, were there other circumstances surrounding this, like the chance, like the context in which this happened, like the audience or whatever the people are around it? When you add up all the circumstances, do you have an act of incitement here? That's when the criminal law will get involved, because it's not just going to be about whether you wave the placard. Well, yeah, but the Parliament, that's what the Parliament came up with.
Well,
yeah.
I don't think the politicians are doing their job, frankly.
Well, OK.